and the locals were very glad to challenge our car. There was a couple of close calls that Hercules began to mumble to himself, and shortly after this animated conversation with himself resulted in a new strategy. He decided to take the toll road and avoid Veracruz entirely. The toll road was immaculate, straight as an arrow, very expensive at the cost of $8, and hence completely deserted. The road surface was so pristine, we might have been the first car to ever travel on it. And at that price, it was entirely possible. Traveling through Mexico, we would hit a police roadblock every 200 miles or so, maybe more. And it was a study in creative bargaining. The various caravans of Central Americans were expected to pay a bribe, a mordita, a little bite, a bribe, an unofficial toll that was negotiated with the local police. Police pay was apparently so meager that they were forced to supplement their income with small donations that consisted of about $10 per carload. Members of the Central American caravans who rubbed these people the wrong way. The members of the caravans, the Central Americans who rubbed these police the wrong way or were suspicious in their demeanor, were forced to make further payments or to make gifts to the local police, a substantial part of their consumer goods. The Mexicans were not naturally happy to see the Central Americans traveling around Mexico loaded down with consumer goods and driving brand new used cars. This was a crapshoot that depended entirely upon the negotiating skills of the driver. Hercules was very deferential to the Mexican police and was very glad to have me donate $5 to the cause of the Police Happiness Fund. We developed a system of good cop, bad cop, where he would smile profusely and ask if he had acted as if he had found a long-lost family member in the person of the police officer. And I, being the evil gringo, would feign poverty and proffer only a small fraction of what Hercules felt like he thought the good officer deserved. It can be helped continually being the evil gringo, the stingy bad guy, but I've learned to live with it. The younger caravan drivers who had the temerity to dispute the amount of the mordita, the bribe, didn't have an evil gringo to fall back on, and sometimes found themselves stuck out on the side of the road in handcuffs, delivering a significant portion of their goods as a gift to these total strangers if they ever wished to see home again. Hercules and I got so good at our routine that the bribes we paid were generally about $2. We drove across the entirety of Mexico with 2 hours of fitful sleep in the cab of the truck, and I was getting giddy from the road. We drove all night, and it seemed to help because there were no roadblocks in the middle of the night. The interior of Mexico was completely different than the north. The vegetation was now lush and green. Trees and orchards and ranches made up the landscape. Further south, we discerned what seemed to be a process at work that remade the landscape of trees and jungle. First, the logging operations came in and cleared the jungle for the valuable hardwoods. And then the newly cleared lands were converted to orchards of lemons and limes and other cash crops. And after a few years, the soil was wrung dry. Then the ranches took over, and fat, expensive cattle wandered back and forth until their time had finally come. When the soil was denuded of all that it could offer up to man or beast, the poor farmers were allowed to move in, and one lean, scrawny farmer, armed only with a machete and fire, worked the land to scratch out a living, if you can call that a living, for himself, his wife, and his numerous children, and they somehow managed to survive. The process seemed to move south toward the remaining jungle that stood still and pristine at the farthest tip of the country. You could almost see the natural world disappearing in real time, right before your very eyes. Hercules had grown more jingoistic and more hostile with each passing mile. I noticed that the banana trees were carefully tended, and the bunches of bananas on the trees were covered with a coarse cloth and net to protect them. Why are the bananas covered like that? Those are covered to keep them nice and beautiful, and in a perfect condition for the good-for-nothing gringos. This guy hated my guts, and he didn't even know me. One minute he would be talking about the good-for-nothing Indians and the good-for-nothing blacks in his home country like Archie Bunker, and the next minute he would declare proudly that he was of Indian heritage. Yo soy de Indio. I am of Indian hair blood. He hated himself almost as much as he hated me, so I tried not to take it too personally. If I wasn't paying for a third of the gas and all the bribes, the morditas, I had a feeling he would have dumped my good-for-nothing gringo ass on the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, or worse. The week before my journey, I started The week before I started my journey to the south, the Indians in southern Mexico had taken up arms and declared war, had taken over 3 towns in southern Mexico, in Chiapas, the farthest south state. They had surrounded the local garrison of Mexican troops in these towns and killed those that had not promptly surrendered. Then they took out all the land deeds at the town hall and burned them ceremonially in the village square. It seemed that they had resented having their land stolen, the jungles bulldozed and burned, and the thieves planting orchards and running cattle on the land that remained that had once been theirs. They held the towns for a couple of days and then melted back into the jungles. The Mexican army and government were not happy to see their authority had been challenged and made to look powerless in this way. This example might spread to other indigenous people in other parts of the country that objected to being second-class citizens with no rights to their own land. The Mexican army moved into the south and began to shoot rebels and anyone they suspected of being a rebel. Every person of Indian descent was suspect and liable to the ultimate punishment. The Mexican Air Force began to strafe people traveling on the roads, and in an effort to prove their impotence and cruelty, they randomly shot at anything that moved for some time. Roadblocks sprang up in the south like mushrooms after rain, and when the local people approached these roadblocks on foot or on horseback, I could see that their eyes would grow as large as dinner plates in undisguised fear and abject terror. The entire 50,000 strong man military was mobilized to the Mexican army and on the hunt, primarily for one man. The leader of the uprising was a mysterious figure who, like all of the Zapatista rebels, wore a dark ski mask that obscured his features. Subcomandante Marcos, as he was called, was an Anglo-looking character who had green eyes, brown hair, and smoked a pipe. He lived among the Indians and taught them Marxist theory, or so it was said, and military tactics. Every man in their army was an equal, and all men had given themselves up for dead in their struggle to retain their land. We are all offerings for the common pit, they said. The mystery man with green eyes that stared intently from beneath the ski mask with his European features was rumored to be a South American, rumored to be a European. Even it was whispered he was an American. I'd seen his photograph with the mask on like everyone else, and despite the mask, I didn't consider myself a good likeness for the man. But in foreign eyes, you know what they say, they all look alike. Hercules had been calling me Subcomandante Marcos in jest for the last 500 miles, but now that we were in the south, it was no longer funny. There was something in the air. Every roadblock we had crossed in the south, the military and interior police were giving me the hard fish eye. And I know I did not really look very much like Subcomandante Marcos, but the locals were in terror of the roadblocks. And the farther south we went, the closer scrutiny I received. Hey, Subcomandante Marcos, here's another roadblock. Get your mask out. God damn it, Hercules. Stop calling me that, or they're going to take both of us out in the jungle, you idiot. Are you crazy? My reasoning seemed to reach him. He didn't call me that anymore. The roadblock was the busiest one yet. There were at least half a dozen cars in front of us, and the interior police and the military were all over the place. Hercules started to squirm and sweat profusely and squirm around in his seat. Ahead of us, people were being taken out of their cars and force marched off to the right, off of the road, and along behind a long brick wall where no one could see what was transpiring. It was done at the direction of one man, a plainclothes man who sported a short bushy mustache and a cruel hard face, whose eyes were hidden behind mirror sunglasses. He had no outward sign of authority other than a .38 caliber pistol hanging out the back pocket of his blue jeans. The man with no eyes would look at a driver or he would look at a passenger, and he would not even have to point. The unfortunate was taken out by uniformed men, dragged behind the wall out of sight. These people exuded a different feel from the ones I had seen before at the previous roadblocks. This man with no eyes had the power of life and death in his hands. This man was used to giving orders and having them followed. He was a man who was used to taking human life with his own hands. It was there in the way he stood, the expressionless look on his face, and the communicated disdain of despite and disdain for the people around him. He was the leader of a death squad. You could either fear him or defy him, but he could not be ignored. I made up my mind in about a minute. I opened the door of the Chevy Suburban and casually walked off the side of the road and sauntered up to the brick wall. "What the hell are you doing?" Hercules said. He hissed it at me. I ignored him completely. We were still 3 or 4 cars back from the action, but the man with no eyes locked his mirrored sunglasses on me the minute I took a step and didn't take his eyes off me. I ignored him completely. I casually and slowly made my way to the wall, stretching my legs and shaking out the cobwebs as I went. I unzipped my jeans like it was the most natural thing in the world and let out a healthy stream onto the wall. I relieved myself with pleasure and took my time, shaking my tool dry, and then casually zipped my jeans back up and slowly, taking my time, walked back to the car. Hercules was covered in sweat and near a state of panic. I had yet to see him sweat even though the temperature was well over 90 degrees. "Please, get back in the car." He was in distress and practically begging. "Please, don't ever get out of the car again." There was an Interior Ministry officer walking up to the car as I settled back into the passenger seat. He walked up to the driver's side and looked over the load once and began to tell Hercules that he needed something to eat. They decided on $5 as the usual, and I pulled out $3 from my wallet like it was my last $3. "Oh well, only $3. It's not important. I can eat some lunch today." He waved us through, and even before we cleared the checkpoint, Hercules was already looking over at me 3 times as if he had asked me if I was completely out of my mind. I glanced at the man with no eyes, and he drew as we drew even with him. He didn't look at me this time, but stared off into the distance as if to let me admire his profile. He had been, as if he had been wearing armor, he could have been mistaken for a Spanish conquistador. I was just glad that I wasn't one of the Indians behind that wall. God help.